Welcome. So earlier video we talked about some of the difficulties that workers in this field report in trying to engage and help a very excluded, hard to reach or to help population with complex difficulties. Now I'm going to just try very briefly to sketch out what we mean by AMBIT. So AMBIT is technically an acronym, but we prefer just to call it AMBIT. It's about adaptation, about moving and developing as a model. It keeps growing and developing as more teams and more practitioners give us feedback about what works. It uses these approaches that come from a field of work called mentalization. It's about bringing together things and supporting a whole range of different ways of working rather than trying to sweep away everything that came before and be the completely new kid on the block. It would rather be out of sight and supporting local expert structures than be sort of the front thing. And it's about a treatment, certainly not a specific therapy. It's the way people treat each other, both practitioners treating other practitioners and the way we treat our clients. We prefer the word, which just means your sphere of influence, what I can expect to be able to achieve and have an impact on, and what I can't. And in the work that we do with these clients, that's often very unclear for us. So being clear about what my AMBIT is I guess, part of AMBIT. Now, we're going to talk about an AMBIT wheel, and that's what I'm going to go through today. I want to be very clear that the AMBIT wheel is just a map. Okay, it's not Paris. Paris is what you are when you're in it, what you see, what you feel, what you touch, and what you smell. What I'm going to go through is just kind of, if you like, the outline of the map. So that's what I'm going to get on with now. So right at the core of AMBIT is this theory mentalizing, and we've spoken about this in an earlier video. Around the outside of that, AMBIT is very much about balancing things. It's about not just putting all my effort into the work that I do with my client, because actually we would argue that's only a quarter of the work. Tempting just to put all my intention in there, but actually if I'm not also thinking about and practicing some mentalizing type practices with my colleagues in my team. And as a team, if we're not actively trying to be more mentalizing with the wider network, and if as a team we're not developing and actively keeping open the idea of learning and adapting our practice so that we keep ahead of the game rather than playing catch up, then this wheel isn't going to go round. And then on the outside of the AMBIT wheel, we've got 8 sort of elements of what we call the AMBIT stance. A stance is what, it's rather a military issue, but a boxer takes, that it's not too narrow. It's how he or she keeps their balance when there's a lot of stuff going on around them. And the AMBIT stance are 8 core elements of practice that many teams that we've worked with over the last decade or more have identified as having real value in helping them not fall out of balance. So I'm going to briefly go through those quadrants now in just a little bit more detail. Starting with this idea that AMBIT is for workers who feel like this weeble that's never quite in balance. I'm always slightly too far concentrating on my client and I've forgotten my teammate, or I'm slightly too absorbed in working on what's going on in my team and I've forgotten my client, or the team has become rather kind of negative about the network, etc., etc. You can never be right in this field, but you can avoid being too wrong. So, working with your client, the 2 elements of our stance that, if you like, we would see as a tug of war, a seesaw. You get one right and the other one can get a little bit out of kilter, are these. Scaffolding existing relationships. We're not interested in sweeping away everything that's been before and being everything to a client, because actually our work will come to an end. And what we've got to try to do is to build on and strengthen relationships. These clients may have relationships with social workers or probation officers that may be much longer than the work of my team. Equally, they may have family members or friendships that actually with a bit of support could become much more sustainable help. On the other hand, the relationships that they have are often risky. And the one thing that we can't be is fluffy about risk. So I could get very into a risk management protocol, do everything perfectly according to the protocols, but actually I may not have a client anymore because they would find me too wooden and too mechanical. So somewhere in the middle, I'm trying to find where I can safely and appropriately manage risk, but work with the relationships that are there and are real in this young person or client's life. Moving across to the team, the two stance elements that we particularly want to pick out, it's not the only dilemmas, are that workers are trying to create individual relationships with their clients, because that's how mentalizing, and that's how this phrase epistemic trust, which is another video to describe, come about. Change happens when I feel understood by you as an individual, not collectively. If you form strong relationships with clients like this, there's a risk. And the risk is that I get isolated, that I come to over-identify maybe with the client, or I come to feel burned out and anxious, or I come to feel kind of seduced into a kind of macho thing that, well, maybe every young person uses a little bit of crack now and again. Maybe it's me getting old and a bit stiff that I'm kind of, seeming to get too anxious about this. I can get anxious about this work and I can feel less likely to connect with my team. So as much energy as we want young people to put into creating, workers to create relationships with their clients, we want workers to put into creating relationships with their team so that they are never isolated. And the analogy we often use is it's like the mountaineer on a mountain. You need to be very good at knowing where to put your ice axes and your crampons, but you've also got to know who's holding your rope and have the calls and the communication between the two of you right, so that if you do slip, somebody's there and somebody can communicate if they see a risk that perhaps I can't see in my particular position. Over on the other side, working with our network, well, on the one hand, we've talked earlier in the problem about the complexity, the multiple problems that our clients have. So almost inevitably, to help them to cover all the domains of their life that are troubled, I'm going to involve other professionals. That risks creating more confusion than help if the network isn't integrated. And we would argue that disintegration is actually the natural resting state of these very complicated professional networks, where there are different trainings, different languages, different priorities for teams, different commissioners. It's amazing that multi-agency networks work as well as they do, often, but often they don't work as well as they could. So the counter to kind of spreading the net, working in multiple domains, is that where I can as a worker, I take what responsibility I can within my ambit, within my sphere of influence, to take responsibility for trying to pull together the most unhelpful places where disintegration is happening, to create understanding across these networks. And we have some mentalizing techniques for both teams and networks to do that. And then finally, learning. We want to be open as a team to develop and adapt to our circumstances, local cultural needs and organisational needs. Well, here the tension is between evidence, and there is evidence-based practice, and it's very disrespectful to ignore that. But on the other hand, the evidence has its limits. It's difficult to say that the exact client group that I'm working with are exactly the same as the client group where there was a randomized controlled trial maybe over in the States. There are similarities, but there may be very significant differences. And the counter to becoming a little bit hidebound and saying I can only do it if it's printed in the book is to be respectful of local practice and expertise. Many of the teams we work with have worked in this field for many years. They know their local culture, they know their local organisational structures, they know the local professionals in the other teams. So that expertise has significant value, and it's the tension between not making it up as we go along, but at the same time not being rigidly hidebound to what one piece of printed evidence says, when actually it may not perfectly connect with. And somewhere between those two is a balance that we're trying to find. So in all, AMBIT is trying to kind of, if you like, help teams to take a more wide-angle view to the work that they are doing, rather than allowing things to collapse either just into the work they do with a client or within that to the other things. So thank you very much for listening to my talk.